and welcome to the programme. This week we're at the Mildura Writers' Festival, where the theme is spirituality and the land. I'll be talking to Les Murray about death, depression, the T.S. Eliot Award and being a redneck. And local audiences have the chance to meet some of Australia's best-known writers. We'll be talking about landscape and the sacred with authors Tim Winton and Peter Goldsworthy later.
The opportunity to meet writers is something that we don't usually have in an isolated town like this.
You know, you sort of get a picture of Les Murray's life through his poetry, but, you know, it's good to put a face with, you know, the sort of, you know, theory, I don't know.
In a small setting like this, where intimacy is on our side, we may be able to just thresh out a few issues and see where regionalism is going and what it means.
Coming to a festival like this, well, to start with, as I say, we get the atmosphere of the place, and it's a great motivator.
Yeah, people like Les Murray and Tim Winton and Peter Goldsworthy coming here is it's heaven, really.
Les Murray is our unofficial poet laureate. Fresh from the triumph of winning the prestigious T.S. Eliot Award and with his subhuman redneck poems selling vigorously, Murray has finally beaten the black dog of depression that haunted him for years, as well as surviving a nearly fatal liver disease. Les, you've written quite a few poems that have poked fun at literary festivals and poetry festivals, and yet you've chosen to come to Mildura. Why?
I suppose we founded this one. Well, really, Philip Hodgins founded this one, but I was in on the beginning of it. I like Mildura. It's a manageable size as well. I mean, most literary festivals are too big. There are too many performers, too many egos, too much kind of intellectual jangle, you know, spiritual jangle. But here it seems to have a sweet atmosphere and a very good, intelligent, well-mannered audience. And you're not, or at least so far, we've not been plagued with dissension and those kind of events that take advantage of festivals to make points.
Now, you've had quite a remarkable year. You've been at death's door and you've won the T.S. Eliot Prize.
In that order. In
that order. How do you weigh up those things? How do you reconcile those things?
Don't have to reconcile them. They just happen one after the other. No. Nearly dying. It was actually very painful at the start, but then they filled me up with pethidine and I floated on a kind of warm opiate haze into hospital, and I woke up half an hour later and they told me I'd been under for 3 weeks.
Did you fight? Were you aware of fighting for your life?
No, not at all. I relaxed for my life. Better than fighting, quite often.
Did you pray?
Oh, yeah. But not insistently, not storming heaven with petitions. I just mentioned the matter.
You didn't try and do any deals?
No. Any deals that have been struck have been struck.
Now that you've won the T.S. Eliot Prize, are you pleased about the fact that it means that the focus is more on your poems than on your opinions?
Yeah, I am. They did try to make it a focus on my opinions in Australia. And, you know, what do you think of... where do you stand on Pauline Hanson? You don't stand on ladies. What do you think of Pauline Hanson? She's a redhead. I was a redhead. I was born a redhead, but then I went grey and lost my hair.
But what's the difference between a redhead and a redneck?
Well, the old legend is about a redhead being hot-headed, you know. And I'm a bit hot-headed too. I just said, no, in point of fact, she's wrong on this and that, but I understand the frustration and sort of justifiable fury that she comes from. People who have been relegated for a long time.
Subhuman Redneck Poems has made it onto the bestseller lists.
Yeah.
How does that feel?
That feels nice. It feels odd. But I've never thought that poetry shouldn't be on bestseller lists. It just hasn't been much.
But do you feel as if you're striking a blow for poetry?
Yeah, I always try to strike blows for poetry, retrieve things for it, you know. Retrieving the bestseller list for poetry is of a piece with various other things I've done, like writing novels in it. And, you know, I don't want it to become the equivalent of music. I think poetry's always got to be special.
You've always been perceived to be part of a country versus city divide, and you've written that our attitudes to rural people are insulting and dismissive, and that country people are wrongly seen as bigoted and ignorant despoilers of the environment. Do you still believe that that's what people in the city really think?
It's always been true. We've always felt the pressure of that belief on us. Not every city person believes it. Not every intellectual in Australia believes it, but it's round as a pervasive attitude. A lot of it is quite vicious because it's persecuting people for things they've been deprived of, you know. They've been deprived of education and culture and then laughed at for not having them. I remember I went to Sydney University and fell on the library like a starving man on a feast because there were no libraries in my time up the coast. There are small public libraries now, but nothing compared with what you'd find in cities. The over-provision of culture in Australian cities exactly parallels the overdevelopment of those cities. They're just right out of whack with the country they're in. Quite common in colonial countries, really. Buenos Aires, for example, sucks all the life out of Argentina, apparently, the same way. I do stay loyal to where I came from because, partly because I am so insistently invited not to.
Why do you despise urban left-wing intellectuals so much?
Because they don't do their own thinking and because they're bullies. They have a schoolyard approach to life, in which you will be dragooned into certain opinions and harassed mercilessly if you don't hold them. I will not tolerate it. When Helen Darville, be she right or wrong, was set upon by a pack of people for showing up their multiculturalism for the fraud it was, I immediately became on her side, you know, even if she is a bit odd.
But did that justify writing a poem about her? Does she deserve a poem in this collection?
Yes, she did. She did, because she was set upon. Any person who is set upon and has no allies. In Australia, we have a kind of a dingo culture in which when somebody is set upon, everybody steps aside and lets them take it.
I've noticed something about your poems, which is that apart from writing about your mother, who died when you were 12, tragically, you've never really written love poems. You don't seem to be interested in writing
The reason for it
is
is in the book. Partly it's privacy, because if it's real love, you get scared of revealing someone else's privacies. Partly also in this book I had to work out what was wrong with my attitude to women, and it was a profound and terrible fear. It was caused by the fact that I thought I'd killed my mother by being born, and because I was in induced birth. After me, she had no more successful births. She had miscarriages, the last of which killed her. So I believed that I was responsible. Sex leads to death. You know, the victim will die. Don't do it. I then got savaged at school, particularly by girls. Possibly it was that I didn't pursue them, and they didn't like this comment on their charms. Really, the problem was that I was terrified of them. And so, in this book, I worked this out. This caused a profound illness in me called clinical depression. And in this book, I fought it. Beat it, and then when I went to hospital, that was the end of it. I still had a bit of it before I went to hospital, and when I came out, I knew something had changed. The black dog was dead. I'd lost the depression.
I want to come back to the depression in a minute, but I remember reading that you cried when you wrote the poem about your mother bleeding to death, The Steel, and I wondered whether you still cry when you write your poems.
Occasionally, yeah, a bit. It's the function of the reader to cry, though.
But did you cry when you wrote the poem about your father dying in this collection?
No, I didn't, because as I said at his funeral, I said, death has come to Dad at last, and he probably thinks of it as a bit of a relief. For 44 years, he didn't consent to live fully because Mum wasn't sharing. And grief doesn't start today, it ends today. You know, he had this profound and terrible grief, and he's now finished with that. He's like an old soldier who refused to live life that his mates who were killed in the war missed. This poem is in memory of my late father and is written in the language we used to speak to each other. The last hellos. Don't die, Dad, but they die. This last year he was wandery, took off a new chainsaw blade and cobbled a spare from bits. Perhaps if I lay down, my head'll come better again. His left shoulder kept rising higher in his cardigan. He could see death in a face. Family used to call him in to look at sick ones and say, at his own time he was told. The knob found in his head was duck egg size, never hurt. 2 to 6 months, Cecil. I'll be right, he boomed to his poor sister on the phone. I'll do that when I finish dying. Don't die, Cecil, but they do. Going for last drives in the bush, odd, massive, board slotted stumps, bony white in whipstick second growth. I could chop all day. I could always cash a cheque in Sydney or anywhere, any of the shops. Eating still at the head of the table, he now missed food on his knife side. Sorry, Dad, but have you forgiven your enemies, your father and all them? All his lifetime of hurt? I must have, grin. I don't think about that now. People can't say goodbye anymore, they say last hellos. Going fast over Christmas, he'd still stumble out of his room where his photos hang over the other furniture and play host to his mourners. The courage of his bluster, firm, big voice of his confusion. 2 last days in the hospital, his long forearms were still red mahogany. His hands gripped steel frame, I'm dying. On the second day, you're busting to talk, but I'm too busy dying. Grief ended when he died. The widower, like soldiers who won't live life their mates missed. Good boy, Cecil. No more bluey dog, no more cow time, no more stories. We're still using your imagination and we're stronger than all ours. Your grave's got littler somehow in the 3 months. More pointy as the clay's shriveled like a stuck zip in a coat. Your cricket boots are in the State Museum. Odd letters still come. 2 more's died since you, Annie and Stuart, old Stuart. On your day, there was a good crowd, family and people from away, but of course a lot had gone to their own funerals first. Snobs mind us off religion nowadays if they can. Fuck them. I wish you God.
Where do you think that poetry and faith connect?
Now there's a difficult one. I think poetry's got 3 legs. One of them's your body, one of them's your dreaming mind, and one of them's your daylight waking mind. You know, and when they're in concert, that's when everything happens that's worth doing in life. And the sacred is probably the 4th leg, which occasionally joins in, you know, from beyond you, and puts the thing in complete balance, you know. But it doesn't happen often.
A lot of the poems in this collection are very painful and sad, and one of the most bittersweet poems I thought in the collection is the one about your 17-year-old son, Alex, who's autistic. Was it difficult to write that poem?
No, it started as a list. I started writing down all things that I remembered about his development. And I quickly realised, yes, this is a weird kind of a poem. And I persisted with it and even asked Valerie 1 or 2 things, you know, do you remember such and such? Oh, yes. And then she'd tell me more. And this composite picture of Alexander is completely timeless because it takes a whole 15 years and it's any point within the 15 years and it's not in sequence. It can be talking about Alex at 5 and Alex at 12 and different ages all the time. It's the only poem Alexander likes. He'd begun to talk, then returned to babble, then silence. It withdrew speech for years. Is that very autistic to play video games in the day? He is anger's mirror and magnifies any near him, raging it down. It still won't allow him fresh fruit or orange juice with bits in it. He swam in the midwinter dam at night. It had no rules about cold. He was terrified of thunder and finally cried as if in explanation, "It angry."
You're an only child and autistic children are very isolated in their own world. I wondered whether you felt there was some kind of affinity between your experience and his.
I'm mildly autistic myself. Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I've got, in a mild way, the same kind of thing as an Asperger autistic has, disabling kind of way. There's a lot of people who are borderline autis. A lot of half the good academics I know are borderline autis. Extremely good at something, you know. They know everything about it, but they may be fairly inept in life. I was no good at human relations.
Eye contact. I noticed that you avoid eye contact quite a lot.
I'm a shy person, that's why, yeah.
What are you reading at the moment?
I'll read anything that'll grip me. And very often I read the first 5 pages and it doesn't grip me. I've been there before. What's terrible is you can reach a point where you can't be bothered reading anything you could do better yourself.
Subhuman Redneck Poems is published by Duffy and Snellgrove. In a moment, we'll be talking about the land as a source of inspiration with writers Tim Winton and Peter Goldsworthy. But first, here's a poem from Peter.
Let's get physical. I was born in a small town with a large graveyard. There were 4 pubs, but 5 churches. There was a 6-pack of grain silos. Each morning milk poured into billies, unscolded. Each month parcels arrived from the country lending library in the city. There was a wall of china on the dresser and coins of water spitting on the surface of the stove. The fields were always green or gold. The sky was endless blue. Any other description would be perverse.
Australians have been accused of being a nation of coast dwellers who ignore their own backyard. But some of our most distinguished writers have preferred to look to the land for inspiration. With me are writers Tim Winton and Peter Goldsworthy to talk about what landscape means to them. There is an argument that says that Australians, Australian writers included, have either been intimidated by the landscape and ignored it, or else they've tried to domesticate it through bush legends instead of actually coming to terms with it for what it is. What do you think about that?
I think that anyone who lives on the land is forced to come to terms with it in a sense and has a profound relationship with the land, even if through maybe ignorance what they're doing is in the long run destroying that land or running it down. So I think we've done as well here as anywhere. Looking at it as in terms of the sustenance it gives us in other ways, the sense of harmony we feel with it, the joy it gives us, I think most Australians have a very joyous and integrated relationship with the bush. That's where they go for their holidays, that's where they fish. And so I don't detect a problem, an alienation there at all.
So do you see those things, those activities like going fishing, going into the bush for bushwalks, do you see those as kind of spiritual pilgrimages? Is that what we're doing?
Well, they're very enjoyable and they're very satisfying, and it's certainly wonderful out in the bush, the still time when the sun's gone down, to sit there and listen to the last birds. Is that spiritual? It's wonderful, and I don't really mind whether it's spiritual or not.
Tim, do you call that spiritual?
Australians are good at enjoying the fruits of the land, if you call that, what we can get from husbanding the land. We're also good at enjoying nature by going out into it. I think where it gets sacred is where you actually do something that costs you something to preserve the relationship with the land and to preserve the land itself.
Maybe the one thing that is missing from my little minimal cosmology is the ritual. We were talking about going out into the bush as, even going and catching a barra up in the Kimberley. There's becomes ritual when it's more formalised and more. I wonder if there's a thirstiness for the bushwalk, say, or whatever the secular equivalents or transformations of the religious impulse are, going to the footy. There's a need for a more formal and ritualised structure. I don't know.
Yeah, I believe in the kind of life-giving force of ritual. I just think it has to be an authentic something that works, and something that
grows from the grassroots rather than imposed, sort of thing.
Yeah, or something that is developed over time. It's very hard to say let's make up a ritual. It's like an afternoon worth of liturgy, really.
Well, it can happen. I mean, Murdoch Super League's just imposed rugby league on Adelaide and got 27,000 people to go along and watch a game they haven't got a clue about. That's creating. And I got a feeling that the religions of the future are going to be imposed by the mass media.
Well, yes, they have in the past. I mean, it worked for Lenin and Stalin, didn't it?
And of course, as
Hitler.
our generation, my generation, and your generation, half a generation behind, get older.
3 generations behind, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. There's going to be a huge, if there is a thirst for the spiritual inner, it's going to absolutely mushroom as the baby boomers hit the verge, hit the void, approach the lip,
and realise that they're not immortal, or even always right. Australians are surrounded by ocean and ambushed from behind by desert. A war of mystery on 2 fronts. What worries us about the sea and the desert? Is it scale or simply silence? Historically, we see ourselves as outback types, although we know we're suburbanites. Still, we do go to the desert more and more. We buy 4-wheel drives and swags and designer gear for camping to make our funny little pilgrimages.
Les Murray dedicates most of his work to God. Would you do that?
I'm a bit wary. I mean, there are mysteries, and there are wonderful mysteries, but and I know they'll never be explained, but as a philosopher friend once said to me, what answer would satisfy you? and I'm prepared to leave it there and accept that they're there. I don't want to necessarily supply an answer called God. So I wouldn't. I'd prefer that. I prefer any spirituality which I might feel to be in small things, in everyday things and feelings, and whether it is spiritual or not, I'm not sure, but I'll enjoy it while it's there.
Tim, would you ever dedicate one of your books to God?
I'd like to think everything I did in my life, I would dedicate to the ground of being, to the divine love, to God. You pick your appropriate or acceptable name, because I feel in my life that I'm spending my life trying to negotiate with this mystery. But I just don't think I'd have the nerve.
As someone who writes both prose and poetry, I was wondering whether you had any theory about why poetry seems to be able to address the issues relating to spirituality and the land, or whatever spirituality means, and the land, more adequately than prose is doing in the main at the moment.
I suppose I think there's a deep sense within us, and it's probably built into the DNA of a religious need, a thirst. It takes the same forms from culture to culture, which that transcultural nature of religion suggests that it's biological, has some biological component. And I think that certainly our sort of, to get really biological now, our memories, which are not a reliable random access memory, they rely on various tricks to remember things, songs and rhythm, story. These are ways, especially in pre-literate societies, we have to remember the information of the tribe, the knowledge. That is the way sacred things are remembered, and that density of statement that poetry has, I think, is close to it is a part of all religion.
Tim, as someone who doesn't write poetry and yet has faith, how do you imbue your prose with a sense of belief?
Peter was talking about the almost sacred impulse of poetry, and I think that the connection there is a lot with music. I think things are sung a lot, and every now and again, even though prose or fiction, which is mostly what I do, can't be as concise and as concrete and lovely as poetry, every now and again it can sing, So every now and again you do get the chance to open up the throttle a little bit and bring things into a story. I think occasionally in Cloud Street or in books like That Eye of the Sky, I've managed somehow to bring a little song into it. I wouldn't call it poetry because poetic prose is just one of those things that makes one's lips curl.
Yeah, but the great sacred texts, whether it's the Bible, the Mahabharata, or Cloud Street, they're prose.
They are narrative, and you can pinch some of the shapes and the forms of poetry. I think that if I have any regrets about doing what I do, it's that I didn't get a chance to paint and write poems, because I think they probably are still the best forms, the best media for talking about landscape and for adoring landscape and looking deep at it. But I don't have a bardic voice. I'm just a prose writer. Ultimately, it's just another novel, isn't it?
But isn't that a kind of poem? You won't accept that.
Yeah, it is a kind of poem, but
just reestablish the hierarchy.
Poems, the way that Les writes them, they're very declarative. They're very argumentative. They can be very polemic. I don't write that way. I don't. I'm kind of shuffling in the dust by comparison. I just can't imagine myself.
But there's an analogue between story and poem in the sense that both are different ways of remembering. Both are mnemonics in a way, and that has both, in that sense, both story and, say, song, which is from which poetry comes, I guess, do have connections to sacred traditions.
Yeah, that's true. I suppose I still have this sense that story is more an entertainment, and poetry is a sort of a more dignified declaration of wisdom, or a digging at wisdom. And ultimately, fiction is telling stories, and I don't think they're necessarily have to be anything more than entertainment.
And that's all from the Mildura Writers' Festival. Next week, Between the Lines makes way for the ABC's Anzac programming, but we'll be back on April 30th with crime writer Linda LaPlante, best known for her Prime Suspect TV series.
I shot a guy when I was drunk on duty. I lost my husband. I lost my kids. I was given the cold shoulder by the force. She said I was on the streets. I was a prostitute. I was drinking with the women I'd busted. I became a crackhead. And for 8 years, I was on Skid Row. And I went, oh, well, that's rather a good story. And then I said, what are you doing now?
See you then. You can hear more about books on Radio National from Ramona Covell on Friday evening and Jill Kitson on Saturday afternoon.